Yeah. Welcome to this global webinar on monitoring impact of cluster work. This is the third of the last global webinar that we are doing in 2019. The TCI webinars are virtual discussions with experts from the network to learn together in an open way about your experiences and also your success and failure stories on key topics that we identify of interest for TCI members. In the first global webinar in April, we covered the topic on how to incorporate clusters into existing economic development work. The second one in June was about how to make cluster organizations sustainable over time. And today we want to dive into how to monitor the impact of cluster work, how does the evaluation process being structured in practice, and how do we evidence and communicate the success of cluster work. These are questions that we have been dealing with for a long time in TCI, with lots of dedicated sessions and workshops in our conferences, and an active evaluation working group that meets regularly to share ideas, to learn about approaches and methodologies that are implemented in different regions, and to provoke new thinking on how to implement in practice the best processes to evaluate the cluster work. This is what they call the evaluation for learning and change. That is one of the things that we will talk about later today. I want to first welcome you all, our participants in this webinar. We have about 109 registrants for the webinar. And unlike the previous webinars, today most of you are connecting from Europe, with some participants also from Colombia, Mexico, Australia, Brazil, we were seeing. That to me makes sense because probably first for the timing of the webinar, that it's more convenient, I think, for most of us in Central Europe, but also because it is in Europe where there are more mature cluster ecosystems and more cluster policy frameworks and programs where cluster organizations also play an active role in the evaluation of cluster work. So very welcome everyone. Please make use of the chat to make comments. There is also a Q&A section where you can make your questions. We will try to post them during the webinar. We are lucky to count with two great speakers from our network who will share with us their experiences. First is Thomas Christensen. He's one of our latest additions to the TCI Board of Advisors. He works at the moment as Head of Impact at the Novo Nordisk Foundation in Denmark. He's International Policy Advisor and Evaluation Expert. And in the past, he had the public responsibilities in the Danish Ministry of Science, Innovation and Higher Education, the Danish Council of Technology and Innovation, the Nordic Council of Ministers, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, well, a lot of public experience. He's also co-author of a great publication called Let's Make a Perfect Cluster Policy and Cluster Program, Smart Recommendations for Policymakers, that I recommend you reading. Welcome, Thomas, and thanks for being with us today. And from always rainy but lively Glasgow, welcome, Madeline Smith. Madeline is member of the TCI Board of Directors. She's Head of Strategy in the Institute of Design Innovation at the Glasgow School of Art. And she's a specialist in strategy and evaluation for clusters, innovation, and complex collaborations. Madeline is what we call one of the long-standing members of TCI Network. She has always been here since I remember, supporting TCI in many ways. And in the last times, leading the TCI Evaluation Working Group, together with James Wilson and Emily Weiss. So we have two of the persons in the planet who can probably talk with more authority and expertise about monitoring the impact of cluster work. And so the webinar moderation should be carried out today by another expert, Emily Weiss, also member of our board of directors with large expertise providing research, analysis, advice and process facilitation in evaluation of clusters and other collaborative ecosystems. Thank you, Emily, for taking the moderation today. And I leave you the virtual floor. Just one last comment, we will be recording this seminar for later dissemination among the members of the network. The floor is yours, Emily.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. What a great introduction, and hello to you all. And no other microphones are on, but we do hear you via the chat or the Q&A. So Patricia and I will both be actively monitoring that and feeding your questions in. I'll do my best to feed all the questions in to our esteemed speakers. And with that, we can move on to the next slide, which gives an overview of the 4 questions. Although the field of cluster evaluation is extremely broad and complicated, we've boiled down today's discussion to 4 questions. And we're going to start off with maybe the most difficult one. How can you track the progress of cluster initiatives? Is there a way to track it? A way the cluster initiatives are usually tracked? And how does this relate to the policy or the program level? Thomas, I'll give you the floor first.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for a nice introduction. And yeah, you're right, Emily, this is a very difficult question. And there is really no standard answer to this question. We don't operate with standard indicators or standard approaches. And the reason is that the purpose of cluster policy can differ across countries or across regions. Also, the purpose of a cluster or an innovation network also differ. So we actually need to have a flexible approach to this. But in general, I would say a few indicators might always be relevant and should be treated as standard indicators. The focus should be on companies, on innovation and research activities, or on other relevant issues for the development of a cluster. So, and also it's quite important that the point of view of the observer is important. If you are a program owner, you have one view. If you are a cluster manager, you have another view. And this will also be reflected in the indicators you use and how to track and monitor the development of activities. Please, next slide.
Sorry.
That's okay. You can see what I mean here. Actually, to keep it simple, you would need 2 sets of metrics. One for communication purpose and one for learning purpose. And especially the program owner and policymaker, but also the key stakeholders, they are very interested in communication of the results of cluster initiatives, and also having been a policymaker myself, is quite important to communicate the impact of cluster policies in order to get support for future funding of cluster activities, but also to get an understanding of the purpose of the cluster. And this also helps to get a high impact of cluster activities. And then the second level is actually the cluster organization level. Here, the cluster manager and the steering group of the cluster, they also need indicators and to track the development of the cluster in order to have learning and to monitor the results of the cluster organization, to improve the services of the cluster for its members, but also being able to communicate to the program owner the impact of the cluster. Since many cluster organizations, they are depending on public money and as well as private money, it's also important for them actually to be able to communicate the impact of what they're doing, and also to come up with interesting cases so they can attract new members and have added value, show added value for these members. Please, next slide. Here I've tried to give an overview of what a system could be. In the middle, we have an example of up to 7 key performance indicators which could be relevant for the program owner. This means when the program owner tries to track the impact of a cluster program, the program owner will not have to focus on the single cluster organization, but will have to take an overall view of the total activities, which is a combination of all the activities from the different clusters and networks which are supported by the cluster initiative. In this area, we have in Denmark good experience also when it comes to the communication of the impact of a cluster program. When we communicate, for instance, the number of innovations created in the companies based on cluster activities, also the development in research industry collaborations or in business-to-business collaborations, which research have proved has an impact on productivity level in the cluster. But also one could look into new ideas or new technologies which are created within the different clusters. But in all this, we're focusing as a program owner or policymaker on the total outcome of a cluster program or cluster initiative. On the other hand, if you can see to the right, here I have invented a medtech and welfare tech cluster as just an example, where the cluster manager and the steering group could be interested in deepening into some of the activities and the results of that particular cluster. So each cluster organization also could have their own indicators where they're interested in following the activities in the cluster in accordance with the strategy of that cluster organization. So again, we have two sets of metrics which are relevant. And so in the best world, of course, there's a synergy between the two sets of metrics. So when the cluster organization collects data, these data can also be used by the program owner. Next slide, please. So in summary, I would say it's quite important when you're operating with key performance indicators and collect data that you try to keep everything very simple. Nobody wants to listen to or be presented to 20 or 30 different KPIs. And if you are operating with many indicators, they are not all key indicators. So you should be quite sure about what are the key indicators. Why are you collecting them? Why are you reporting on them? What is the purpose? Do we have a communication purpose or do we have a learning purpose? So that is my very long answer to your very simple question.
Well, it's a very broad question. And a point of information, we've been asked if it will be possible to download the presentation afterwards. And Patricia, can you confirm that we'll make this available on the TCI webpage so that participants can see all the details and all the slides afterwards?
Yeah, of course, you can have my slides.
Yeah.
Great. And
yes,
then,
we will share with them all the presentation, the recording of the webinar also if they want to see it again.
great. And then one specific question from Marcos Ferrasto in Brazil. Are patents still a good indicator for measuring clusters' innovative activities? If you can give a quick response, Thomas, and then we'll give the floor to Madeline.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Are patents still a good indicator for measuring clusters' innovative activities?
It's a difficult question. Yes and no. Of course, well, we have we operate normally with indicators which are easy to collect and to communicate. And I wouldn't say patterns are easy to collect and to communicate. So because if you want to use to monitor development, you should be able to understand what you're monitoring and be sure that you're monitoring the right thing. So I would say having simple KPIs are helpful. Patterns and mapping of activities are a little bit more difficult when it comes to communication and learning.
Great. Madeline, can you share with us your views on how do you monitor the progress, or how do you track the progress of cluster initiatives and this whole relation to scope of the policy level?
Yep, no, very happy to. And some of the things I'm going to say, thankfully, I'm in agreement. I'm in vehement agreement with Thomas. I may say it in a slightly different way, but I think we're pulling out some of the same points. I often find it useful to look at, well, what are the different people, as Thomas quite rightly said, different people will want different things from the results of an evaluation, the results of a monitoring framework, because they're interested in different aspects. And when you're setting up a monitoring and evaluation framework and setting off in an evaluation journey, then it's really useful to understand what is the focus and the scope of the evaluation, because those audiences will want different things. So if you look at why is there a cluster program in the first place? It's because there is a need for an overall objective around a change in the regional innovation system. So there's wanting to be improved competitiveness in that region. It might want to look at increasing certain sector opportunities, changing some of the industrial structure. Maybe there's an opportunity to diversification, making it attractive as a region. So those tends to be the regional policy maker. Why are we investing in a cluster program? And so for some of the focus of an evaluation, it may be about that regional benefit and that regional impact. And some of those metrics will be looking at those changes over a longer period of time around, are we generating jobs? Are we generating GDP, GVA? Are we seeing that change in the industrial infrastructure? So that's a really interesting level to be looking at from a policy evaluation point of view. A lot of the time, though, when we're looking at a cluster evaluation, we're actually looking at what is it the cluster is doing, which tends to focus on the programs that the cluster delivers, the activities that it actually delivers. And that tends to be around a series of what are the priorities for that cluster in that region. And it may be about investing in innovation programs. It may be about some shared physical assets that are invested in from that region. It may be about new finance and funding models. It's very often about skills that are needed, new and different skills that are needed. It's very often about exporting and internationalization, and quite often it's also about talent attraction and retention. So all of these things may be a specific program that's delivered, and so sometimes the evaluation of a cluster is looking at the activity of that actual cluster. So that's the what. The really interesting thing I think about cluster evaluation and clusters, as opposed to any other kind of innovation or territorial policy, is that it is all about collaboration. It's what can you do together that we cannot do on our own? And one of the things that we therefore must not forget in evaluation is how can you show the value, the added value of doing things collaboratively? And that would be both at an operational level, about stimulating collaboration between firms or between firms and research institutions or a whole range of different triple helix actors. And it also can be around collaboration from a strategic and policy point of view, is how can we actually align the different interventions that happen in that region and make them all be pointing in the same direction to help the cluster objectives and the overall policy. So looking at those types of partnerships, that type of the depth of collaboration as well. So because you start off doing something which isn't too risky, but you begin to build trust, and over time you may start to see deeper levels of collaboration. And it's really interesting to see that collaboration journey and try and find ways to track those metrics. Trisha, can I have the next slide, please? So if that wasn't complicated enough, the other aspect is that actually what really is the scope of that evaluation? Because as I say, you could be looking at the projects, the what, but actually what you're probably doing is talking to the firms, to the actors and the firms and the other actors in the cluster. So you're seeing what the impact has been on them. Then you could be looking at the cluster organization, both the range of projects it does, but also how good is the cluster organization? Is it effective with its use of resources and the way it goes about managing and operating as that cluster? And then the third level could be, well, actually, we're not the only cluster that's working in that region. Very often there's a cluster program with a number of different clusters supported from that policy. So it could be that your evaluation scope is looking across those different clusters and looking at that program level. And if you click again, Patricia, I'll add one more layer of complication. The issue is that we don't work in isolation. We don't work in a nice little bubble, this is what clusters do over here. We're actually in a normal territorial competitive system. So the firms who are working as part of a cluster will be affected by whatever is happening in that system, but also the clusters can have an effect on that system. So quite often these days, we're also looking to see, are there any systemic effects that are happening that maybe over the long term are changing the competitiveness of that system, contributing to things like overall SDGs, so the development goals that are wider than just GDP and wider than just economic. Are there some wider areas that we also want to see change? Well, actually, the clusters can play a role in that as well. And increasingly, we're seeing in evaluation the need to measure some of those wider impacts as well. Because you have to understand that the system has an impact on the clusters, but the clusters can have an impact on the system as well. Patricia, could you press on again? So in an effort to make some sense out of that multi-layered, three-dimensional chess conversation that we have about cluster evaluation, certainly within the cluster evaluation working group and through studies that we've been taking forward in a number of different areas, we've been trying to pull out, is there a sort of standard framework of effects? So where would you see a change happen? Where would you see impacts happening? And over what kind of timescale? And so if you're looking down the left-hand side, you will see certain changes on the individual, on the actors, the firms and the organizations within the clusters. You'll see certain changes in the cluster, in that group, that collaborative group. And then you'll see certain changes, you hope, within the system, within the territorial system. And it's been quite interesting to look at both the immediate effects, what do you see in the short term, and then what could you look to see in the longer term. I think one of the mistakes we make in evaluation is that we want to see those economic performance indicators straight away. And we need to be realistic and honest with ourselves that actually we ought to be looking at some of those early signs that those changes are happening and look for those measures in the first immediate years of delivery, rather than just diving straight to, we want to see economic performance indicators. So it is quite complicated, but that's one of the reasons why we're trying to tackle this as part of the cluster evaluation working group. And what we're doing now is trying to build some potential indicators, just as Thomas was saying, that these are potential indicators which you have to take and make sense for your particular context and your particular cluster. But at least that gives a framework to try and model the effects that you're looking for.
Thanks so much. I think you both have done a really good job of answering a very difficult overarching question about how to track the progress of cluster initiatives and the program level, bringing up the major point of no standard indicators. It all depends on the objective of the initiative itself and the objective of the policy. But it's a good idea to keep in mind, keep it stupid, keep it simple, stupid, about with your KPIs, there are KPIs for communication, kind of headline indicators, and KPIs for learning, and for helping the initiative itself develop over time. And also, Madeline, I think it was great to bring up the different scopes of evaluation, which Thomas also addressed. And there's a policy level, there's a cluster initiative level, but it's also how that interacts with the system as a whole, and the different levels of effects that you want to look at and bring in a light on. You can't ignore this collaborative level. You maybe want to jump to the economic performance, but you need to keep an eye on the collaborative level. Now I have a question from one of our listeners.
Can I come back on the patent one? Just to the patent one was around. I think patents have often been used as a measure of innovation performance, and they are an indicator that collaborative work has been done. I think the thing that always strikes me with patents is that they are only a step in the way, the step on the stage for an innovation to be implemented. You can have a patent and do nothing with it, or you can not have a patent and implement tremendous innovations. So it tends to be one that's easily measured, so is often ticked as part of a measurement portfolio, but particularly with the service industries, with creative industries, for example, all sorts of other sectors, it's very difficult to be able to use patent data as a performance of innovation. And if you look at a lot of the manufacturing side, they may have some patents, but largely it's about delivering new products and services, and they don't wait for a patent to do that. They just get on and do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Madeline, for clarifying that. I did not hear the word patent, but I heard another word, so thank you so much. And I'm really happy about your presentation. I can agree in everything you said. It's more or less that we are one person, so thank you for that.
Isn't it wonderful? Great minds think alike, they say. We have one additional question from the participants. Rob Stewart asks, can you comment on the role of firm-level benchmarking in creating program impact indicators, as well as guiding cluster design and policy decisions? And I maybe firm-level benchmarking is up to interpretation. I don't know if this is like firms participating in the initiative benchmarked with firms not participating in the initiative, or maybe Rob can type in.
We have done some studies in Denmark where we compared three companies participating in cluster activities with companies not participating in cluster activities. And we have tried different methods to compare with different control groups. And in most cases, we actually can show that when it comes to the impact of a cluster in terms of collaboration, productivity growth, but also R&D spending, the companies participating in cluster activities actually perform much better than similar companies not participating. Of course, you need to have the good data on this, and so we have been very much dependent on the dialogue with cluster managers to identify the companies, and then use national register data to identify control groups and look at the longer run to see the difference in development between the different group of companies. But it's certainly interesting, and also in terms of communication with, for instance, our finance ministry. It has been very important for us to show that we could see impact not only in cluster, in companies participating in the cluster, but also we could see added value compared to a non-participating group. And this is normally the type of methods which are needed to convince people that this is an added value. Because sometimes people would say you would see a change anyway, regardless participation or not. So you need to identify the best research methods and here benchmarking with other companies are one tool.
So just to add a couple of thoughts on that, I have some challenges with benchmarking between firms, but that's largely because I live in the UK and our data is just not good enough. So we can't find publicly available data that gives us a suitable control group. It's either too far out of date, or it's not specifically defined enough. And as such, we find it really difficult to find a suitable control group. And you have to go so far away from your actual group that you're either in another territory or you're in another sector, in which case is it really a good comparison? So we do struggle with that. I do know, however, that in Scandinavian countries, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, you do have much better publicly available data that is accessible. So you can get those like-for-like comparisons and then see the difference. We struggle for that in the UK and in many other parts of the world to get that level of data. So what I find, we can't really have a control group, can't really have a counterfactual. And so one of the things that is useful to do instead is to make sure that you have a good baseline, so you know where you have started from, and at least you can start to show change. But yes, the much better data is one of the many reasons that I'd love to move to Scandinavia.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
a lot to you both.
The dark side of having these good data is that everybody, the companies and the people are registered and controlled from their birth to their death, so we know what is going on for everybody. But having said that, also of course we have some example of natural experiments where we have a lottery of companies participating and not participating in collaborative activities. So you do not need to have good registered data if you could try to identify alternative methods to see the impact of cluster activities. So a lottery where you try to expose companies to certain activities and then compare the companies and their development to other companies who have not been offered the same possibilities. That is an alternative way to identify the impact of cluster activities.
Well, Rob, I think you've got some excellent answers, and he's commenting that he has gotten some excellent answers, and thank you both very much. Now we're going to try to squeeze in some more questions. So next one up. How are different cluster stakeholders included in the evaluation process? Thomas.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Yeah. Well, this is an excellent question for many reasons, because stakeholders are the key to evaluation. If you don't have a dialogue with stakeholders around the cluster, then you will not be able to have a good evaluation. Of course, you need to know the purpose of the evaluation. There could be 3 different levels of evaluation. One could be just to have a documentation of activities, and here, of course, you're dependent on that the people who register data, register activities, and report the data, so you know what is going on. Then, of course, the next step could be a monitoring of the development. That could be a development in activities, but also the economic development of companies participating in cluster. And then a third area could be the identifying the additionality or the impact of the cluster. And these 3 things could be the focus of a program owner as well as a cluster manager. In all cases, you need to have clear collaboration with stakeholders, because you should involve the stakeholders in the design of an evaluation and also of the data collection. You also need to have collaboration with stakeholders when it comes to implementation of an evaluation, because again, you are very much dependent on the collection of data and the processing on data. And then, so that is at least our experience, that when it comes to evaluation processes, stakeholders around the program owner, the policy maker, but also around the cluster organizations and its members are extremely important, and you need to involve them in different levels depending on their role in relation to the cluster. Either they are cluster members, so you need to identify interesting questions to address to them, or they are funders, and here you have maybe another perspective, or it's the cluster manager who wants to evaluate his or her performance and services to the members of the cluster organization. I have tried to set up some slides which could be used as a template. So please, next slide, Patricia. So this is a slide where you can see if you have a cluster program, then you need to have there are, of course, an overall objective or purpose of the cluster program. Here we have an example where the purpose is to support business to business and business to research collaboration with the aim to boost research, development, and innovation that cultivates structural changes and renewal of in a certain sector. So that could be an example of the rationale for a cluster program. And then quite typically in the cluster program, you have different key themes. For instance, one key theme could be to promote business-to-business activities, and other could be to build bridge between research and universities. Third one could be to attract talent and qualified skilled workers to cluster members, and so on and so forth. So within the cluster program, you need to clearly identify the focus areas of the cluster program, and then of course you need to identify which clusters you support the different key themes or focus areas, because not all clusters are the same. You have some emerging clusters, you have old clusters, you have clusters within the IT sector, you have clusters within the food sector, and so on, and they have different history and different purposes. So, and then also the members of these clusters have different needs. So it's not necessary that within the cluster program, all clusters contribute to all themes. So you need to have a clear overview of that structure. This is also about collecting data, of course, but also to focus in an evaluation on who are contributing to which areas. Next slide, please. So if we take, for instance, a key theme that is business-to-business activities, then within that theme, that could be which are supported by some clusters, then there could be different type of outputs and outcomes and activities. So that you need to go through this and identify the different type of concepts or focus areas within this theme, and then try to collect data on this. And then, of course, have so you will always say that you cannot have an indicator if you are able to identify a data source. So you can collect data. That could be a survey, but it could also be external register data. And then you need to reflect on whether this is a key indicator for the cluster organization, or a key indicator for the program as a whole, because you should make up collect data and make a success criteria for areas where this is not part of the overall purpose of the program. But some of the activities could be success criteria for a cluster, but not for the overall program. This is to be a very simple way of trying to get an overview of how you could collect data and identify the areas where you need to have an evaluation of the performance. Of course, this has the focus of what I'm showing now is on the outcome and impact of the cluster program and cluster organization. But also in this case, maybe you are more interested in having some learnings from in the cluster organization. What can you, what works and what does not work? And of course, in this case, you also need to have evaluation of the processes within the cluster. In this case, the dialogue between the cluster manager and the members are very important. Here, the cluster manager should also have a survey and identify the needs of members. And also the same with the program owner. The program owner also need to have a dialogue with the cluster managers to identify how the cluster program can be improved, what works and what does not work, in order to identify what should be the next generation of that cluster program. So this, so you need to have some approaches which make it possible for you to identify data sources, collect the relevant data, and focus on the right things when you evaluate a cluster organization or a cluster program. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Thomas. And Madeline, what are your perspectives on this question about how different cluster stakeholders are involved in the process?
Okay, so I think I'm going to be vehemently agreeing with Thomas again. If you take nothing else from this webinar, there's two key messages that I'd really love everyone to take. One is that evaluation is all about learning. So it should be about what's worked, what's not, how can we do this better, what should we do next? It should be informing your strategy. And the second thing is that you need to involve all those who are interested and involved in the cluster evaluation. So there's a couple of things that I think it's about evidencing the value. People are investing in a cluster, whether it be the funders who are investing in it, or whether it be the participants in the cluster investing time, energy, if not money. So everyone is investing in the cluster, so they have to see a return on that investment. People often think of, networking, collaboration, it's a sort of woolly thing to do. Actually, no, it's a good business sense. So people invest in it. Businesses invest in being in a cluster because they know it makes good business sense. So they want to see what that return on investment is. So for those participants, we need to be using the evaluation to be able to evidence the return on investment, but also then input into learning and strategy. So it's, I think evaluation often is seen as a threat. It's something that's done to clusters rather than with clusters. And actually, if you can get everyone involved in setting up what's important for me to measure, what is it that I want to see as evidence of change, then that helps me justify why you should continue to be part of this cluster, why I need to justify to my senior management team, for example, why I'm involved in the cluster, or why the cluster gets further investment from the policymakers, why the policymaker invests further, and they have to make that justification as well. So everyone is looking for that evidence. So evaluation shouldn't be a threat. It's very often seen as just audit, but it should be much more than audit. It should be about evidencing that return on investment and showing value. So it should be part of that policy strategy development process. And one of the things that I think is really important, therefore, is involving all the stakeholders and therefore co-designing your evaluation. If you come in with something top down and say, this is what we're going to do, then those who are having that done to them aren't going to see the benefit of it. And it's a bit of a chore and a bit scary, because all it is really is the funders asking me, did I spend the money in the right way? Whereas if you can co-design your evaluation, then everyone is getting something out of it, and you're much more likely to get better input from all the different actors, and will therefore get a better evaluation result. Patricia, the next slide, please. So I couldn't be given the floor to talk for a wee while to anyone who'll listen without plugging the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group. So the reason we were formed, Patricia already mentioned it, and I see quite a few names I recognize in the participants. The reason we were formed is that we were all struggling with this. We're all saying, well, we're looking at these different aspects about cluster evaluation. Maybe we can share things together, good practices, develop some new approaches if there are common challenges that we're looking at. So we've been meeting since 2013, and we've met twice a year, once at the global conference and once in a working group meeting. And I think the really interesting thing is that it is a complete mix of cluster practitioners, cluster managers and other practitioners, cluster policymakers, those who are in charge of the programs and funding, and academics who are interested to research on how this mechanism works and what doesn't. So I truly believe you need that triple helix, those different perspectives, to properly evaluate the triple helix. And that's what we've tried to do within the Cluster Evaluation Working Group, collaborating to improve practice. And next slide, please, Patricia. And this is just a little, look, we've been to all sorts of different places with different groups, and some people who've come more frequently, just to try and update and improve and develop new approaches and new mechanisms and tools that people might want to look at. And you can see all that on the TCI website. So that's a little plug for the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group, who are an example of you need to involve everyone and co-design your evaluation.
Great, thanks to you both. Before we hop into the third question, and we only have 13 minutes left for 2 more questions. We have a question from a participant, Mats Williams in Sweden. Evaluating the performance of cluster organizations versus the performance of clusters or their members must be kept apart, right? Maybe Madeline, you can comment on this in terms of scope of evaluation of cluster performance of cluster organizations versus clusters performance.
I can't see Madeline at the moment. I think
okay.
She
Well,
might be reconnecting.
Okay, Mats, we're going to table that question for a moment and dive into question number 3. Thomas, the floor is on to you. How can we evidence and communicate about cluster initiatives' success? And maybe you can touch on an answer to Matt's question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I have tried to summarize in what you could call top tips and good practice. Well, the best way to collect evidence and communicate about cluster success are actually to identify and monitor annually, I would say not more than 2 to 3 key performance indicators, which are systematically communicated to the public. At least our experience in Denmark has been that this is very, has a good impact. We actually managed to communicate with the Danish Parliament in very simple way, just communicating 3 or 4 indicators on collaboration, on new innovation, new products, and productivity impact in companies participating in cluster activities. And we did that once a year in a communication to the Parliament. And in addition, we also tried to identify some good cases from cluster organizations. So we asked them to send to us good examples of, for instance, a new innovation or a solution to a societal challenge, a successful company. Once we did a prize competition where we awarded a prize to the best cases from the clusters, and we received more than 100 good cases, and it ended up in a catalog with 25, and we gave prize to 5 good cases. So this was also very good communication and a very effective one. And we also engaged our stakeholders in this type of communication. And that's another important element, that actually we engage stakeholders and cluster members of communication of the impact of clusters and also the good results from the clusters. So, and in this case, it's also quite important to identify key stakeholders so you know who should be receive information of the activities in the cluster. And we have actually an experiment with the cluster ambassadors, which are prominent people in the society, which have been appointed as an ambassador for a specific cluster and are communicating the activities of that cluster to the society. The use of social media is the key now, and we see the effectiveness of communicating new information, cases, impacts, assessment, evaluations, and so on are extremely effective on Facebook, LinkedIn, and other social media. This is a clear must in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. How about Madeline? Welcome back, by the way.
Sorry, I do apologize. It wasn't that. I was just trying to avoid Max's question, obviously.
Maybe you can wiggle in a response to how you evidence and communicate about cluster initiative success, and is that different from the cluster organization's performance?
Okay, so it does link in. So I think that some of the key things that we need to think about is you need to think about the audience, who's interested in the cluster success and the story that you want to tell. We've talked a little bit about context. So understanding that external context, actually the way you communicate success is very dependent on what's happening in the external context. So, for example, in a declining market, a flatline performance is actually quite good. So how do you bring in that story of that external context? And certainly here in the UK, we're in a crash course of how to deal with uncertainty in your context, which changes daily. So understanding those variabilities is quite important. We've talked a little bit about counterfactual already in the baseline, so I won't go into that. And the causality thing is that it's quite difficult to say we did this as a cluster and it resulted in this change. However, if you've got a basket of evidence that you're pulling together, then you can tell that story about these are the different changes that we saw because of the activities we had, and that's quite a good story. One of the things that we found quite useful is actually you're telling a qualitative story, you're telling that story of change, which is really important in that cluster journey and that cluster narrative. But if you can make it slightly quantitative, find some hard measures to show change. So I used to, if I'm scoring my connectivity with my other cluster partners on a scale of 1 to 5, then when I first started getting involved, I may be scoring them all at 1 and 2. And in 3 years' time, when I've built some really good collaborations and that trust has built, I may be scoring quite a few of them at 3 and 4. Now, actually, that's still just telling the story of a qualitative change, but I've put some hard measures on it. I've put some changes, and there's nothing that, if you're communicating success, there's nothing a policymaker likes better than a graph, especially if it's going up. So if you can put some numbers on it and show that change over time, actually, that's a very, very powerful way of communicating that change. That doesn't get away from the fact that actually some of the best ways to communicate change are telling the stories. This is how it used to be, and this is what it is now. And I think communicating that change, I think, is really important. Case studies, there's a lot of work that goes on to case studies. I don't think we've really, it's a question that came up at the last cluster evaluation working group, and we're keen to take it forward, is actually what makes a good case study. Do we really understand the elements that need to go into a good case study? So that's something that I think we'll probably explore so that we can start sharing. These are the things that you ought to include to really put your story across.
Thanks, Madeline. I think both of you have made very similar points. Again, great minds think alike about the importance of the basket of evidence, telling the story of change and evidencing that, and the strength of using success stories as well as using hard measurements. Our final question, another big broad one. How can we develop better approaches to capture the impact of clusters and foster learning? And I'm going to have an added tagline on there as well. And how can TCI Network help in this, developing better approaches? Thomas.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an excellent question. Of course, everybody wants to have better approaches. I think a key element is to formulate a strategy for your approach. A strategy for the evaluation, the purpose, the ambition, and so on. And the 3 key elements in this strategy are actually data in different ways. Data architecture, that is an important thing. The portfolio reporting, what are you actually reporting on? And then also the ambition with respect to data analytics. So everything in order to have a good evaluation is actually to have also data-driven evaluation. This does not mean everything has to be quantitative. It could also be qualitative, as Madeline said, and I fully agree on that. Next slide, please. If we take the data architecture, well, our experience is that you need to have a system for collecting data. And sometimes if you have a cluster program, you collect data in the application process from the applicants, but also you need to make a platform for collecting or the reporting of activities and results. And here, actually, the program owner can have an important role, because they can make available platforms which can be used for cluster organizations. So they collect data in the same way, and at the same time, this platform could be of such high quality, so it could also be used for administrative purposes within the cluster organization. And then, of course, combine internal data collection with external databases. In some countries, these are better than in others, but you should always try to identify what are available outside your house, so you don't collect data which already exists, because nobody wants to report too many times. Next slide, please. So on top of this, of course, then you need to discuss with yourself what type of evaluation or practice. I mentioned that before. You could have the need for only a documentation of activities, the aim to assure that something is actually happening, but this you do not need to evaluate. But you could also have the monitoring perspective. You want to track and analyze performance, focus on key indicators, and then the evaluation perspective, which could be either the evaluation with the learning purpose, but also with the impact purpose, what are the additionality of the activities. Next slide, please. So, and finally, of course, there are so many new tools you can use in order to analyze data. So these are, so you should try to explore the possibilities to identify new type of tools and methods which can be used: web scraping, visualization of data, machine learning tools, register data, or other type of benchmarking, and so on. So try to be creative when you are improving the evaluation and the monitoring of your activities. I think I am approached by very young people almost every day who have the skill of using new digital tools which did not exist when I was born, and you know, this is a development which continues to go on. So it's quite important that cluster managers also try to have a dialogue with young people who can actually see new things which we old men cannot see because we are not used to being engaged in machine learning activities. So this is, I would say, my conclusion on this. There are many ways to improve the evaluation, and you should have a strategy and be open to do things in a new way.
Thanks, Thomas. Madeline, how about your perspective on this? How can we improve approaches?
So I'm really pleased that you talked about data and the use of data, because there's all sorts of data out there that and mechanisms that we're not actually using. And it links into the point I was going to make, is that one of the ways to improve it, I think, is about thinking about evaluation right at the start. Too often we wait until 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in, and then say, oh, we need to do an evaluation. And then you're thinking, oh, I wish I knew how it had been so that I could have seen the change. I wish I'd started collecting data about this. So if we can think about evaluation at the start and what are the buckets that we want to start collecting data into, that will help us show the change over the time. And if we're thinking about evaluation, you can keep it really simple and just ask yourself these initial questions. Is how are we measuring success? What is success to me as a funder, to me as a participant in the cluster, to me as a cluster manager? How can we show change over time? So do we know where we've started from if we haven't got good publicly available data, so that we can show that change? Who needs to be involved for us to gather that data? And also, who cares? Who cares about this story that we're about to tell? So who are the audiences that we need to convince to help us either justify further investment from myself as a cluster participant, or from funders, etc. So who cares about the story we're trying to tell? And next slide. And one of the things that we also did coming out of a number of times ago on the Cluster Evaluation Working Group is we pulled together some principles to guide evaluation, which we've talked about a number of things on this list over time. But I think it's quite useful just to if you're thinking and you're just kicking off on evaluation and you're trying to build it into the way that you do your cluster or your cluster policy, then just think about those different principles to guide that evaluation, because it does help you shape the evaluation in the right way. So I've now added a third thing to my list of messages I want people to remember. One is evaluation is about learning. Second is you need to involve everybody in the so it's done with them, not to them, and start it now. If you're asking the question, when should I start evaluation, then the answer to that is you probably already should have started.
Great points, great points. And I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for final words before we round this up. Madeline, I'll let you go first.
Well, thank you. So I think the points that I've just been making are the ones I want to make. The evaluation should inform what you do next. It is the flip side of strategy. And so it should help you with what we do next, evidencing what's happened past, but informing what goes next. It's very complex trying to do a cluster evaluation, but employing a basket of data and a basket of evidence helps show the change that we've made. And co-designing with your stakeholders and your partners is really important, because then everybody gets some value out of being involved in the evaluation, and therefore will contribute to it as an active part of their policy and practice.
Thanks. Thomas, 30 seconds.
I agree very much with Madeline. The purpose of the evaluation is extremely important. What is the purpose? Why is it necessary to evaluate? Then keep it simple. Not too many indicators, then you would be confused. Then it should help you to learn and to improve. And then, of course, you should also be able to communicate the results of the evaluation. These would be my 4 guidance.
Thanks so much to you both for all of your wise words. And a final invitation to you all listening. We can develop better approaches together if you come to Antwerp. The TCI's next global conference will be held in Antwerp, the 8th to the 10th of October, Antwerp, Belgium. We hope you can come and that we see you there. We will be getting together within the TCI Cluster Evaluation Working Group. We'll be hosting a session on developing new approaches and talking a bit about these success stories and creative use of data and things that we've been mentioning today. Thank you very much for all your questions, and thanks to very much the speakers, and I hope to see you in Antwerp. Bye, everybody.
We give you a virtual applause. Excellent. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you all for participating. Bye.
That was fun.
There was.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to copy all the comments and everything for our minutes. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, all.